As you all know, I'm usually a philosopher and psychologist, and I'm talking about Mary thought experiment, a variant of it, where Mary is wondering what it's like to undergo an acid trip. So this is an article that is forthcoming in the book Philosophy and Psychedelics by Hauskeller and Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. It's mainly based on talks at the conference with the same name at Exeter earlier this year, and it includes articles by the speakers. So you probably know the Mary thought experiment. Could Mary, an expert neuroscientist who knows everything about human neurophysiology and neuroscience and physics, like in an ideal way, could she infer what it's like to see red based on science alone? And if not, why not? And this is a problem for physicalism, which can be considered as the thesis that physics can describe all of reality or capture all facts about reality. So when you know all of physics and science, there is nothing left to learn. And it seems that when Mary sees red for the first time, she learns something what it's like to see red. So this is a problem. Possible physicalist responses include phenomenal concepts strategy, which claims that phenomenal concepts like red refer directly to the reference or include the experience itself as part of their mode of reference. And my approach has some similarities to this, but I focus less on concepts and language. Quite on the contrary, I go against language. And then there's eliminativism or illusionism, which is gaining prominence. It claims that it takes science very literally and holds that there is nothing else to know besides scientific facts. And when Mary sees red for the first time, she doesn't learn anything new. So eliminativism denies the existence of, on the metaphysical level, it denies the existence of qualia or phenomenal properties, which constitute what experiences feel like. If qualia are understood as something distinct from those properties and processes that physics and science models. And then there is Brazilian monism, and my approach is very similar to that, except for I don't make this intrinsic-extrinsic distinction that Brazilian monism is based on. On my view, what Mary learns is an epistemic question and not mainly a metaphysical question. And assuming that she learns something, what is it and how does it differ from scientific knowledge? My goal is to illustrate two varieties of knowledge by focusing on psychedelic experience. And the background theory is naturalistic monism. It's like Philip Koff said, it's like Brazilian monism without intrinsics. It holds that there are no distinct class of properties for phenomenal and physical. Everything is one. All properties and processes belong to one single kind, but there are two ways of knowing those properties or processes. So, just briefly about this background theory, naturalistic monism, it holds that experience is what science models as a neural process. And that sounds quite trivial, but the main thesis is this kind of Kantian ignorance about things in themselves or processes in themselves. We cannot know what entities are beyond our observations and models of them. I cannot know you beyond my conscious representations of you. I don't know what it's like to be you. I only represent you. Schopenhauer made the same thesis. So the important difference between naturalistic monism and Russellian monism is that naturalistic monism doesn't postulate the existence of intrinsic properties in the sense that they would be completely non-relational and separate from the properties that science models. Russellian monism is based on the idea that if two entities interact in a certain way, then that's based on or grounded on how they are in themselves intrinsically. But science has no access to their intrinsic nature, that is their categorical or non-relational nature. And that's how Russellian monism explains what Mary learns. Russellian monism says that Mary learns about these intrinsic properties of what she previously knew extrinsically, or whose extrinsic properties she previously knew. So it's two distinct classes of properties, intrinsic and extrinsic, and it can be considered as a form of property dualism. So according to naturalistic monism, what an experience feels like is its happening, or the happening of the process that science models as a specific kind of physical process. So, for example, if I would go into some scientific measuring device like fMRI and would imagine redness and blueness and other kinds of colors, the scientist would see different kinds of activation patterns, and what is producing those activation patterns that the scientist observes are my experiences. So my consciousness would be the hidden cause of the scientist's observations. And there is this radical difference between what is causing the observations and how the observations are appearing. What the scientist sees is this quite ordinary physical processes, changes in blood oxygen level in the brain. But what I'm undergoing is different kinds of colors. So there is this radical discrepancy. But on this view, naturalistic monism, it doesn't reflect the existence of two kinds of properties, but instead what a process is in itself and how it affects measuring devices and the senses of observers and how it's scientifically modeled. So it implies a kind of parallelism between scientific models and observations of things, or rather processes, and the processes in themselves. So we know in one case that it's consciousness that underlies the scientific observations when it comes to scientific observations of experiences. Here it's about psychedelic experiences, but it can be any kind of experience. Here we know the hidden cause because we are the hidden cause, but in all other cases we don't directly know the hidden cause of our observations because they are distinct from us, so we can only represent them. Okay. So much for the background. Then about psychedelics. Classical psychedelics are serotonin, this specific class of serotonin receptors called 5-HT2A. They are agonists on that receptor, so they increase its activity, and they include LSD or acid, mescaline, and DMT and psilocybin, which is included in so-called magic mushrooms and other psychedelic substances, but which are not the serotonin agonists. They include, for example, cannabis, MDMA, ketamine, nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is interesting because it was the one that William James used in enormous amounts and also wrote philosophy about that. He said that he only understood Hegel's philosophy under the influence of nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas. I don't know if that counts as in favor of Hegel or as a counter-argument. And psychedelics produce an altered state of consciousness or a mystical experience with the following key features. It is ineffable, it has no quality or is felt as true sometimes said that it's more real than reality. And unity is also a central aspect.
Sorry, what is this ineffability in Finnish?
Sanoin kuvaamaton. Impossible to describe in words. And unity is what I'm focusing mainly here. So the question about Mary on acid is analogical to the classical question. Could Mary infer from neuroscience alone what it is like to undergo an acid trip? If not, why not? So why psychedelic experience? Is it just a curiosity, or why is it interesting? I will argue that it's interesting because it has features that can shed light on this epistemic gap, and the central feature is unity. So it can shed light on the question of what does science not tell. There's this tinfoil hat here because it's like this conspiracy association. What does science not tell? But I hope to show that it's not like a conspiracy theory or any kind of like universal skepticism or anything like this, like irrational kind of thought. And I wanted to include that. So, psychedelic experience can demonstrate the difference between unitary and relational knowledge, which can be summarized like this. Experience in itself, or this, constitutes unitary knowledge that is not about anything, it's non-intentional and non-relational. And the term this, it comes from Zen philosophy mainly. It also plays a key role in many versions of the phenomenal concepts strategy, but the word this is only an instrument to refer to what is actually going on here, and it also refers to this process here, what I'm now undergoing and which is sort of entangled with your conscious processes. So we know it every moment through being it, even if we cannot describe it. And science gives relational knowledge that is always about something distinct, or knowledge through observations and theoretical models. And it also includes this relational knowledge, even introspective kinds of knowledge, or subjective reports of experiences, or any kinds of descriptions that are distinct from the experience that they are describing. And psychedelic experience demonstrates the difference between these two kinds of knowledge. So here is an example from Michael Pollan, who recently wrote a book on psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind. It's also called ego dissolution, and it plays a central role in these mystical type experiences that psychedelics produce and how they bring about their therapeutic value in psychedelic assisted therapy, where it has been shown that the therapeutic effect is mediated by the depth of the mystical experience. So he describes how he lost whatever ability to distinguish subject from object, tell apart what remained of me and what was Bach's music, became a transparent ear indistinguishable from the stream of sound that flooded my consciousness until there was nothing else in it. So it's like this experience of unification with what is experienced, where there is no subject of experience and the experience itself. Another example from Aldous Huxley, there is the band Doors here because they took their name from Aldous Huxley's book Doors of Perception, he writes, "The legs, for example, of that chair, how miraculous their tubularity, how supernatural their polished smoothness. I spent several minutes, or was it several centuries, not merely gazing at those bamboo legs, but actually being them, or rather being myself in them, or to be still more accurate, for I was not involved in the case, nor in a certain sense were they, being my not-self in the not-self which was the chair." So this demonstrates also the ineffability of the experience, because language operates on this subject, predicate, object basis and brings in this kind of duality. But in this experience, which is like completely unitary experience, there are no distinctions in a sense anymore. There is just the happening of a process. So this is really simple claim. I think it can be illustrated in many ways, but the point is like extremely simple, at least on the superficial level. Mika Pekkola and Mikko Väänänen recently wrote this book, which is called This, Tämä, which is more like a collection of poems, not really analytical philosophy. So this is independent of descriptions about it, experience in itself. And there are many descriptions about this or consciousness, and one is what I just used, the term consciousness or experience, which are usually used when we describe consciousness from the first person point of view. And then there's neural process, which we use from the external perspective. And this is not completely trivial, because how we choose the description of consciousness, or what this is here, it determines our philosophy. For example, eliminativists think that the only correct way to describe consciousness, or whatever it is that the term consciousness refers to, is in terms of empirical science, as a neural process, or some kind of function, or information, computation, and so on. And they disagree strongly with the, I would call them subjectivists, like panpsychists like Philip Goff, or David Chalmers, who emphasize the subjective quality of the experience, what it feels like. But this is connected to the question of how we describe this, because the eliminativists and the panpsychists, for example, the extreme ends on the spectrum, it's like highly likely that they experience the world in the same way. If you, they suffer and they enjoy pleasure and happiness and so on. They just describe these experiences in different ways. So some people think that eliminativism denies the existence of consciousness, and they deny that there are like pleasures and pains, and some even think that it's unethical because they eliminate these phenomenal states, which could be argued are the grounding for ethics. But what they really do is they just give a different kind of description of experience, one that is in conflict with the panpsychists, or, for example, Chalmers' description of consciousness as something qualitative. So the point is that there is experience in itself, or what we could minimally call this. There is no theoretical problem or question about consciousness, no mind-body problem if we just focus on this experience in itself. But the mind-body problem comes from how we describe this as quantitative or qualitative, so we are led to this conflict. So this is experience when it's not characterized in any way, and I know it through being it. But is this not a contradiction then? And when I say that it's this, when I try to minimally refer to it without describing it in any way, I nevertheless use the word this to refer to it, and the word is distinct from the conscious process, what's happening now. And the speaking of mind now, what is this? This is a koan in Korean Zen to ask, what is this? And the point is that we don't answer that question, we just start to wonder, what is this? And we stop there. Of course, we come up with different kinds of like descriptions and explanations of what this is, but we see that all of these descriptions are separate. They are sort of like artificial, distinct from this. And then they basically stop. But what is the role of language here? Because I'm speaking now. So is this like nonsensical speech that I'm now saying when I'm describing that which cannot be described? I'm trying to do that, experience in itself. So I would like to say that I know this process of conceptual reflection here right now through being it. I am this process here, it unfolds in time, and all these words are that process which just happens. And when you consider it as this kind of process that unfolds in time, just this kind of happening, then there is no distinct referent from the words that I'm using now. If I say that the experience is this, then experience is distinct from the word this only when it's considered, the experience is considered outside the process of uttering the word this. But when at this present moment, I'm uttering these words, it's just a process unfolding. It's like a performance. It's not really symbolizing anything anymore. It just happens. So it's kind of like birds singing, a natural process that happens. And I am that process, and I know it when it happens. So this is the reason why Zen is so opposed to language, because it leads to recursion, regress, when we try to capture in words that which is sort of independent of words. But that's not correct to say either, because this is also experiencing itself what is happening right now, and it's a conceptual process, or you could say that it's a conceptual process. You can characterize it as a conceptual process, but what is it in itself beyond that conceptualization? It is this. So paradoxically, even the process of conceptualization is a non-conceptual process that happens. The concept of conceptual process is only a label that is given to it. So I'm afraid that this is like completely obvious to you, or that you don't understand at all. I find this highly interesting. So this leads to recursion, which is also a central part of psychedelic experience in kinds of fractals that people can visually experience, and also on the conceptual level. In analytical philosophy, I think Tarski's theory of truth is the closest analog of this recursive process, when Tarski says that truth should be defined semantically by postulating a meta-language. When we say that the sentence, snow is white, is true if and only if snow is white. We are just using the same words in parentheses or without. And we can never really access what snow is in itself. So it's kind of a trivial point, but I think it's also profound. So Alan Watts puts the point by saying that the Godhead is never an object of its own knowledge. Just as a knife doesn't cut itself, fire doesn't burn itself, light doesn't illuminate itself, it's always an endless mystery to itself. So what this means that I know consciousness through being it, and this part of physical matter, all of what scientists or physicalists would call matter, I know this process through being it. And it's just being. It's not reflecting on itself because life cannot illuminate itself or knife cannot cut itself. Consciousness cannot see itself because it's one. It cannot step outside itself and reflect on itself. It's always one. Okay, I have some other slides left before we discuss. So, to summarize, psychedelic experience brings forth the distinctness between scientific or other models of experience and the experience in itself, which can be a bit paradoxically described as this. And the epistemic gap is the difference between this and models of this. So this widens basically the epistemic gap because it entails that if I, for example, characterize my own process of being here 5 minutes ago as speaking, there is an epistemic gap because what happened 5 minutes ago is distinct from the label speaking. I didn't categorize it in that way when I was speaking 5 minutes ago. So the epistemic gap is the difference between unitary knowledge or this and relational knowledge. I think Zen philosophy puts this best. Here are some quotes. The object is an object for the subject is a subject for the object. Know that the relativity of the two rests ultimately on one emptiness. And then emptiness is also called this in some sources. So I feel a bit like I'm self-conscious when I'm reading these, and they sound so like artificial. But what they try to do now, this academic context of speaking philosophy here is not the right context, because what these poems are trying to do, they try to capture this kind of consciousness, which if you just superficially read it, it's like trivial or nonsensical. But when you have that experience, it feels profound. Of course, that's not a good argument for anything, that it feels profound, but it means that it's, you could say that it's an altered state of consciousness. Well, there are many similarities in Zen meditation and psychedelic experience. Another quote which speaks about how it's always present, but when we try to capture it, it escapes. This is right here with us ever retaining its serenity and fullness. It is only when you seek it that you lose it. You cannot take hold of it, nor you can get rid of it. While you can do neither, it goes on its own way. You remain silent and it speaks, you speak and it's silent. The great gate of charity is wide open with no obstructions whatever before it. This great gate of charity, I think, I'm not so familiar with Zen Buddhism, but what it means here, but it means this kind of like illumination or this kind of non-reflective presence that you can attain in consciousness. So Russell had a similar idea, knowledge by acquaintance, but it's not the same. It's similar. It might be that Russell meant something similar. In some sources, knowledge by acquaintance is defined as the most intimate way of knowing anything. So he writes that I say that I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object. That is when I am directly aware of the object itself. It's always about the subject being acquainted with the object. So the subject having knowledge about the object, of the experience, for example. I know my experience, I have knowledge about my experience, but this is not unitary knowledge, it's relative knowledge. They are related but different. So it's quite obvious now what the point is with Mary. Mary learns what most the pointers or the models are about. This is a bad illustration of the epistemic gap. I didn't want to use these like stereotypical psychedelic images because they don't really capture, like nothing does, what it's about. It's something that might correspond to what an artist might paint like that. But what the scientist sees is the effects of this experience when the subject is in the fMRI scanner, for example, under the influence of psilocybin. It's the consciousness of the subject that causes these images. It's mediated through the measuring devices, of course, but the measuring devices are not what makes it special. It's what makes it special is what it is in itself as just a process unfolding and how it affects the senses and measuring devices of external observers. So Mary gains unitary knowledge, or which could be called this, that is constituted by the happening of the experience. So she can say, this is what it feels like. Well, the same point is also made by the phenomenal concepts strategy. But what the phenomenal concepts strategy says is that the knowledge she gains is constituted by the phenomenal concepts, which are concepts. And the point here is that what she gains is non-conceptual knowledge. It's just the happening of the experience. And I take it that this can be generalized to other similar cases like Jackson's original Mary. When she sees red for the first time, what she learns is the happening of the experience. So she doesn't gain knowledge about anything. There is just her consciousness is transformed into a new mode, one would say. So this is in contrast with Brazilian monism, because this account, which is based on what we call naturalistic monism, it holds that science can model even the phenomenal field, all the properties of the experience. Because if we take it that the phenomenal field of the experience is its happening, the process, its occurrence, and if we assume that science models that process as, for example, a neural process, in the sense that the term neural process refers to that conscious process, then it follows that science does model the phenomenal field of the experience. Because the field is nothing but the happening of the process that science models as a neural process. So Mary knew descriptions about the experience and descriptions about what it feels like, but she didn't know what the descriptions refer to or what they are about. So And the other side of the coin is that science is limited to giving relational knowledge or extrinsic knowledge or knowledge through observations and models. What we see here is this bubble chamber where you shoot charged particles into and they produce these beautiful patterns. And you can infer, for example, their charge because there is that electromagnetic field that changes the direction of the particles. And science cannot give access to the observation and model-independent nature of reality. But so this is the same Kantian ignorance thesis that underlies Brazilian monism, except for this ignorance is explained in a different way than in Brazilian monism. Brazilian monism says that these, what we see here, they are relational properties of the entities that science models, and that there is some intrinsic nature underlying all of those relational properties like charge and acceleration. But what naturalistic monism holds is that it's compatible with a process ontology, or the thesis that entities are exhausted by relations, that there are nothing but relations or processes, how things interact. That if you consider an atom or an electron in isolation from everything that it interacts with, then it's nonsensical. There is no such thing as an electron in itself, in this sense, like taken apart from all its relational properties. And this is important because many philosophers of science, and actually many scientists also like Carlo Rovelli, they hold that relations and process is all there is. And then they say that there is no intrinsic nature. That philosophers are wrong in postulating these intrinsic natures, but intrinsic nature exists in this epistemic sense that we don't know what the processes are independently of the human observer. So it's one thing to say that, of course, even processes or relational entities are the way they are independently of being related to an observer. But that doesn't entail that they would have some like completely intrinsic nature independent of all their relations. It's two different things. So this leads to the question of, this is mainly a worldview question of what is matter beyond the scientific models and observations. I won't go into that. One can make different kinds of arguments about how we can infer possibly from our own case, like Schopenhauer says that we should infer nature from our own case and not the other way around. This is essentially compatible with standard physicalism, that this is what matter is for the part, at least for the part that makes up my existence here, or certain kind of neural process, or how would you define it then. And all other material processes belong to the same general kind as this here. All physical processes are continuous with this. So with this kind of thinking, or naturalistic monism, which is the framework for this epistemological thesis, it implies a kind of parallelism between our models of reality and reality in itself. So we can maybe infer from our own case to the other cases, at least that there is some kind of continuity, as the scientific models show that there is a continuity. Neural processes are made of neurons and molecules and atoms and so on. So there is no strong emergence, there is only weak emergence. Everything belongs to the same ontological category as this. Okay, thank you.